Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For those that do not know me, my name is Daria Loy, and I head the Design and People Experiences team. As outlined in our racial justice commitments, we recently embarked on an iterative journey to debias Mozilla's user research and design processes. And as part of that process today, I am so delighted to introduce you to a scholar that I deeply admire and a human that I love, Dr. Dori Tunstall. Dori is a design anthropologist, a public intellectual, and a design advocate who works at the intersection of critical theory, culture, and design. She is Dean of the Faculty of Design at OCAD University and the first Black Dean of a Faculty of Design anywhere. So now there is so much I love and so much I could tell you about Dr. Tunstall. I could tell you about her program at OCAD to decolonizing its institution. I could talk about her work around the work she's done in Australia as Bryn Mawr University in design anthropology. I can tell you about the director role at Design for Democracy, her efforts to organize the US National Design Policy Initiative, her industry position at Sapient and ARC Worldwide. There's so much I can tell you. I've been following Dori's inspiring work, brilliant career, and remarkable global impact for, I was counting last night, I think it's 2 decades. I'm a big fan, and I am so very grateful that she could make time for us and to share with us her work on respectful design, which includes possibility models for diversity, for inclusion, and decolonization. So Dori will present for the next 40 minutes. We will have time for Q&A at the end. Please use the Moco channel for that, for questions. Direct them to Tara. She will pick them for you. And then James Keller will facilitate the Q&A at the end. So I'm really excited, Dori. The stage is all yours.
So first, Daria and Tara, thank you for the invitation to communicate, engage with you. I'm going to try to keep my presentation a little bit brief, just because I want the most part of the conversation to really about that dialogue and engagement around what it is I'm sharing and how it connects with some of the things that you're experiencing or like to experience at Mozilla. But let me begin with a land acknowledgement. So at least I here in Toronto acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians upon the lands in which I am gathered. Many of you are also gathered on Indigenous lands. So I begin my presentations with this as part of our commitment to respectful design and decolonizing design. And I hope you all learn who are the traditional owners and custodians upon the lands in which you're gathered everywhere around the world. So as you know, I'm from OCAD University, which is the oldest and largest art and design institution in North America. Well, in Canada, the third largest in North America. As indicated, I'm the first Black and Black female Dean of a Faculty Design Anywhere and a design anthropologist and African-American. And a lot of that, what that means is that my approach to design is very much deeply embedded in my multiple intersectional identities. And my understanding of design's possibilities is based on the way in which, in some ways, we need to advocate for more respectful design. And so I changed the title a little bit to sort of emphasize the 6 steps for diversity, equity, and the decolonization of design. Because I think what I really want to emphasize today is the work that can be done and has been done at OCAD University to really create the conditions for diversity, equity, and decolonization. So this image is an image by one of my faculty members, Gary Taxali, and it's from a workshop that we held when I first arrived almost 4 years ago at OCAD University around trying to define what it means to engage with design respectfully. So what does it mean to engage with respectful design? As a design anthropologist, I'm very much interested in what's the relationship between values, how they're translated through design into tangible experiences. And my work and my career has moved through, in many ways, looking at how you align design and experiences, but also how do you articulate different values, which then are made manifest through design, and then again, create experiences for people. The ethos of OCAD University is respectful design, and instead of me telling you what that is or providing a definition, I've asked many of our faculty members to articulate in many ways what respectful design means to them. And we focus on meaning because there could be multiple meanings. Like when you give a definition, you're always fighting over one definition. But part of being respectful is to be open to other possibilities and open to other interpretations. And so this is a small presentation of what that is.
At OCAD University Faculty Design, we practice what we call respectful design. Respectful design, what does it mean to the Faculty of Design? It means valuing inclusivity and people's cultures and ways of knowing through empathetic and responsible creative methodologies. It means deepening our relationships to the lives of materials and the crafts of making.
The challenge facing design today is really to reestablish the relationship with nature. In other words, to design ourselves back into the environment.
For example, adding the indigenous concept of 7 generations to inform sustainable design.
Good design takes a certain amount of humility. We have to recognize that we can do harm as well as good.
It's about need over want. Respectful design means acknowledging different values, different manners of production, and different ways of knowing.
The widest possible range of diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, and beyond.
Designing futures with inclusion and belonging for everyone. Come join us here at OCAD University's Faculty Design and find out what respectful design means to you.
Now, this ethos around respectful design comes from the understanding that design has been quite disrespectful, especially to BIPOC communities in land. And BIPOC, we mean Black, Indigenous, POC, and I'll break down actually in my presentation. Well, communities are given separate designations in this particular way. It's to the fact that that disrespect is so great that many of my students feel like they have to choose between their beautiful nuanced identities and being a professional designer. Because the model of what it means to be a professional designer does not in any way reinforce their unique identities. And so the values of design have been and still are for them and for many other BIPOC communities, colonial, white supremacist, patriarchal, and capitalist. And these are all systems that have actually done significant harm to BIPOC communities. So I'm gonna frame a little bit around the way in which, why decolonization is necessary, and in many ways, its close relationship to design. So I'll start with a kind of a framework that I think is useful even if you're not living in the North American context. Like I've given this talk in South and Central America. I've given this talk actually in Europe and had some really interesting conversations. And so I want to lay out in particular the kind of structure of the settler colonial state, but to recognize the fact that these structures may actually have effect in many places around the world. So this structure comes from the work of Eve Tuck and W.K. Young around a really seminal article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. So if you haven't read that article, I would definitely suggest it. And what it does is it really talks about the fact that the colonial state creates 3 positionalities. There's the indigenous, which is the original owners and custodians of the land. There's the settler who has come over to the land. And then there are slaves. So those who've been brought to the land in an involuntary way in order to extract their labor. The reason why, when I first came to Canada, I was wondering why there was this term BIPOC. And the way I figured it out, it has to do with the differences between Black, Indigenous, and POC communities. And POC means, in the context of Canada, it means Latinx, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, so anyone who's non-white and non-European, and then who's neither Black or Indigenous. That it really has to do with two things. One, what is your relationship to the land? And then what is your relationship to assimilist policies that have been put up by the colonial state, the settler colonial state? So in the settler colonial state, the land has been stolen and pillaged. And then in terms of policies, they're all assimilationist policy are geared towards the genocide of those who are not European. So in the context of sort of Black, you know, and we see the manifestations of this in sort of the Black Lives movements that are happening now globally based on the incidents of the murder of George Floyd in particular, but numerous names of Black and Black trans individuals who've been murdered by the state. That they have been brought to the land involuntarily, and that they are unassimilatable within assimilationist policies. And what I mean by that is that, like, my name is Elizabeth Tunstall, which is an English name. I speak English. We share many different aspects of culture with Europe because we were stolen from Africa and forbidden to practice many of those traditional practices around language, even in terms of the movement of our bodies and dance. So regardless of that, the design of the settler state in and of itself means that by being white, the opposite of that is to be Black. And to be Black, to accept Blackness in its full humanity would require actually this dismantling of the entire settler state. And so what it does, regardless of whatever language that Black people speak, how much they're a shared culture, they are still considered unassimilatable by the state in and of itself. This actually has an impact in terms of design. And one of the things that I always really try to talk about to my students is the way in which design has been really quite harmful. And so I'm going to look a little bit at my notes because I think it's really important that you get the facts around this. So the image of here is African-American slaves using the first cotton gin. The first cotton gin was established by Eli Whitney in 1793. And basically, if you don't know what it does, it actually separates the seeds from cotton. Now, in creating this, and this I have to remind my students, like by design, what happened when the invention of the cotton gin is that the population of slaves rose from what then was around 700,000 in 1790 to 3.2 million by 1850. So the harm in this design was because Eli Whitney was trying to reduce the labor of slaves. So he knew that slaves were actually producing the labor for this in hulling cotton seeds because it took 1 day. By reducing the efficiency of that to 1 hour, that then there was more slaves who were needed to pick more cotton. And so in this way, again, like the invention of a cotton gin, this sort of design of something was so quite harmful that it literally increased the number of slaves and extended slavery by almost nearly 100 years. And it created 5 times the number of enslaved people by design. He knew that this would potentially happen in the design in and of itself. In terms of the indigenous communities, again, indigenous people in the relationship to the settler state are the original owners and custodians of the land. And they have been fighting in many cases for 500 years from assimilist policies relating into, in North America particular, there's been boarding schools in which indigenous youth, children were taken from their communities, placed in these boarding schools, which basically operated as prisons, and stripped of their language, stripped of their culture, even stripped of, like, there is all these photographs of having their hair cut. in order to assimilate to sort of the settler state. Now, how design becomes implicated in all of this is that, again, every other week, there's another controversy that happens all over social media around let's say, a fashion designer appropriating indigenous motifs. Just a couple of years ago, there was like the Dior campaign, Savage, which created a lot of controversy. In 2015, this British fashion label, KTZ, stole the sacred design created by this Canadian Inuit shaman named Awa. And the reason why they felt they had permission to do that has to do, again, with that sort of colonial state and the way they think of indigenous people as gone. So you don't have to ask permission to take from someone if they're not there, if in your mind they're not there. Now, again, the shaman Awa's granddaughter was still alive, right? And was actually the one who actively protested the stolen of the design. But again, this is the way in which that design has been quite harmful in its impact on indigenous communities, and the way in which it continues in some ways to treat indigenous peoples as if they have been successfully exterminated. And so issues of appropriation and misappropriation are easily remedied by having conversations, negotiating with the original creators of the thing, and to stay away from motifs, practices, and things that are actually quite sacred. Because in terms of the cosmology of those indigenous communities, the misuse of that motif actually affects the universe, right? So by misusing this particular sign, you can actually cause harm to the entire universe, not just to that individual and their family in that community. And so why issues of appropriation and misappropriation are so important is because oftentimes what is being appropriated is the sacred. And you only would feel entitled to be able to do so if you felt like the people who are the guardians and custodians of the universe through the use of this and they're not there, right? If you thought that they no longer existed. And that's the way in which design has been harmful. And then in terms of like POC communities, again, that their relationship to the land is oftentimes they've had to escape home to become new settlers. And in the last 150 years ago, many of that has to do with the process of settler colonialism in their home countries, which created conditions that made them come to, let's say, North America. And then in terms of their relationship to assimilationist policies, that in some ways compared to indigenous or to Black, they have the privilege in some ways to choose. Now, all of these choices are quite painful, but they can make decisions in some ways to no longer speak their language. And we've had long intergenerational conversations around, parents not allowing their children to speak their home language so that they can more easily assimilate. And then the grandparents or the grandchildren wanting to actually go back and learn the language because they want to reconnect with that language and world perspective and culture and community. But compared to, again, to indigenous communities, compared in many ways to Black communities, that they have some privilege based on their class positioning, where they fit in terms of the colorism, about how they want to position themselves in relationship to the similar state. But they still experience this deep discrimination, intense racism, all of these sort of things. And so this is an advertisement for, again, washing powder. But at the forefront of this images is the endorsement of the Chinese Exclusion Act that basically for almost 100 years kept Chinese people out of not just the United States, which passed the act in 1882, But also in Canada, where I live now, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which also prevented the Chinese for immigrating to Canada to preserve its Europeanness, because it felt, and I think for those of you who are in Vancouver, the repercussions of that, even now today, is still being felt by Chinese communities. And in the context of COVID-19, it's being exacerbated by the sort of anti-Asian xenophobia that is part of how many of those who are positioned as settlers have responded to the pandemic. So again, just to sort of say that in many cases, we like to think of design as like a helpful tool, in some cases, a savior. But for many BIPOC communities, design has been deeply disrespectful and in some cases quite dangerous in the ideas and the practices that it's put forth as it affect BIPOC communities. So just to be clear, because sometimes decolonization is about Indigenous land sovereignty. But again, we are engaged in many ways in a political process to create the conditions that allow that to happen. So in the context of me being a dean of the faculty design, my contribution to decolonization is, again, not to treat it as a metaphor, but to understand in many ways that we need to liberate design from what we call the modernist project. And what I mean by that is, you know, in Europe in the 1800s, there was a really interesting social movement that was happening around the modernist project. And in the context of Europe in the 1800s, makes so much sense. You've had you have an aristocracy, so the ideal of sort of progress through technology to bring the luxury of the aristocratic lifestyle to the masses, to the peasantry, is a declaration of revolution, right? Then in the context of many, many, many years of inter-European conflict, which we still see and the repercussions of today, hello Brexit, that this ideal of like dropping your national and ethnic baggage to become part of universal mankind, right? Let's get rid of all the literatures that indicate this is Italianates and this is German and this is all of those things and become sort of universal, is an act that is quite utopian. But when you take those ideas and you bring them to North America, you bring them to India, you bring them to China, you bring them to all these places in the world, they become basically colonization 2.0. Because the way in which you produce luxury for the masses is through making it cheaper and faster. And the way in which you make it cheaper and faster is that you don't pay people for labor. Hello, slavery. And you extract from indigenous lands, right? For which you also don't have to pay for. So that revolutionary ideal in a European context becomes, again, quite harmful when it's exported to all these other places around the world. Again, this notion of like, drop your ethnic baggage and become part of universal mankind, that becomes assimilationist policies that are quite genocidal in the way in which they impact different communities and especially indigenous communities around the world. So for us, the project that we're undergoing in terms of respectful design is to separate the history of making from this modernist design project because it has been, again, really harmful to BIPOC communities. So now that you're adequately depressed about the history, let me change tones and talk about what are the things that you could be doing to address this situation, to address the way in which design in some ways needs to redesign itself in order to create space for diversity, equity, and decolonization. And I'm going to give it in 6 steps. These steps are not chronological, so that may sort of give you this caveat. And they're based on kind of things that this process of transformation that we've been doing at OCAD University ourselves. So the first step, again, not chronological, but just in terms of importance, is to put Indigenous demands first. As I've just gone through, the quote unquote original sin of this whole process of colonization has been the theft of land and the genocidal policies that have affected Indigenous communities. Here in Canada, we've had an apology, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and a set of recommendations which actually set in motion this process of transformation at OCAD University. But it's one of those things that, you know, especially when I go back to the United States, like I feel like there needs to be more work to talk about what's our relationship to Indigenous communities. When we're recruiting, how are we recruiting Indigenous peoples to be part of our teams? And it, again, in the United States, Black dominates, Latinx dominates in terms of like issues of underrepresentation, but oftentimes there isn't that same focus on Indigenous. And it's really important because the criticality that they bring to the institution around respect and disrespect is so important for the process of transformation. So some of the things that we've done at OCAD University is we had an Indigenous cluster hire. So 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, we put out a call for Indigenous individuals across any art and design field. 5 of them, we were looking for 5 of them because we wanted to create critical mass. And they were from Turtle Island. And we said Turtle Island explicitly because we were trying to recognize that Canada versus United States versus Mexico versus Hawaii, that these are all colonial boundaries. So our Indigenous faculty who were already there crafted a language to express an Indigenous perspective on whom we were seeking to recruit. Very successful, and then really emulated many places around Canada. I wish there was greater emulation in the States and other places, but definitely it sort of set a precedence for other, especially art and design institutions in Canada. And so that was really important. And then they got here and they've done the work. So at the picture of this other buffalo at the bottom, that is from some work that one of my faculty members, Howard Monroe, who was actually in the video. So the language he was speaking is Mischief of the Métis people. So he's Red River Métis. He's taken the design process and aligned them with the 7 grandfather teachings. And like, again, you can read up later, find him and get that work. But what we want to show you as a teaser is like the analyze research phase is the respect phase. So he's realigning our foundational understanding of what design is, so that it's not about an external process of what you're doing, but the internal cultivation of the kind of person that you need to be in the world from an Indigenous perspective, right? So for me, I always say like my key performance indicator is to be walking around campus when we're back on campus and, you know, 4 or 5 years and overhearing the conversations of students saying, like, how did you handle the respect phase of the process, right? That we've shifted the language of design so that it's now based on Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of being. And we had lots of forums in the community around what does decolonization mean, so that our community, we did cultural competency training in terms of understanding Indigenous history, and Indigenous contemporary issues that they're still expressing, so that our community was ready to understand and also accept the new Indigenous faculty that we brought into our community. Which is important. So like the institution has to own up to their racism and white supremacy. If you And like I said, in some ways that could go first or go second. My thing is that what was really important in terms of, again, us having indigenous catalysts for change is that they helped the institution see very clearly how racist and white supremacist it was, right? So this is why these are not in necessary chronological order, but the institution does have to recognize. And OCAD University had to do this. It undertook a task force. The president at the time, Sarah Diamond, took a task force of underrepresentation, did community consultation. So this is the image of the Alphas Hours. Again, set out a bunch of recommendations around hiring for diversity and changing policy, and then facilitating conversations. So I facilitated a panel discussion, but also some workshops on whiteness without white supremacy. Because what's important in this process is that my community is still like probably 80% white. So the majority of the work that has to be done by the white allies, and let's say even race traders in the community in terms of understanding their identities and how they fit as those who've been labeled white, but to do so without a sense of white supremacy. And I know I've been told that you've already gone through some of the work with Tima Okun in terms of understanding white supremacy as a culture. So we've been working through understanding like, okay, that it's not just about the individual, but it's about the culture. Do we have a culture where we think progress is about being bigger? Or are we looking at things from 7th generation thinking? Are we hoarding power instead of sharing it? Are we thinking again about individualism as opposed to thinking as a team? Are we saying there's only one right way of doing things as opposed to thinking through different paths? So these are values that we need to shift in our culture and in our community and ways of being in order to create the conditions in which everyone can flourish in their differences, including white people. Because a lot of the language around decolonization, diversity, and equity can be about like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. So then that leaves the question open, what is it can be done? And like I said, 80% of my faculty are still white, so they have to do the work. And so part of the work for them is shaping an identity of whiteness that is not harmful to others. And it has to be done in a generative way. So I do a workshop on whiteness without white supremacy where I have them imagine who's a white person who inhibits all of these other values around appreciation, different path, teamwork, conflict resolution, et cetera, which for me is always Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rogers. So Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So if like all white people could be like to express the values and the practices of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, we wouldn't have to decolonize, because that would be the act of decolonization in and of itself. So owning up to the fact that there is a white supremacist culture in your institution and to own up to sort of racism is a really important part of, again, making this happen. So then third is to establish authentic relationship to BIPOC communities. This is me everywhere. And what's been really important is the different levels at which I've had to spend 3 years, almost 4 years now, attending the community events, going to the community shops, coming in the evenings, representing in many ways, reaching out to the youth, and then reaching out, like there's a First Fridays that was happening, which is a really important networking event amongst the Black community. And literally for the first year, I went to every First Friday. So every Friday from 7 to 10, I was there trying to understand what the community needed, what the community wanted, and then how they would want to use OCAD University as an institution to help it to flourish, to provide it with its resources and access to be able to flourish. And and it had to be done at the institution, at the level of the institution. So again, I have individual Black faculty members who are deeply embedded in community, but it's not the same. And one moment I realized is that when I had gone to the event and I peeked my head out and someone said, OCAD is in the house, right? And that was really important because it meant it was not about me as an individual, but it was about the institution, feeling that the institution was present, and they were present in a way that was not trying to extract or take something, but present in a way that was there consistently and ready to give, ready to share, ready to find what's the win-win in this relationship. And so you have to build those authentic relationships. Still working with you. Make the call for applications about BIPOC community interests, not just your own interests. So we just recently successfully completed our Black cluster hire where we brought in 5 new Black faculty into the faculty design for the first time in 144 years. And one of the things and ways in which we were able to be extraordinarily successful in this is that we wrote a call that spoke to the interests of Black communities. So first, recognizing the importance of their lived experience, and then saying, we're not looking for an interaction designer, right? But we're looking for someone who's interested in Black speculative futures. We're interested in someone who is into Black hip hop or other cultural aesthetics. And there was a way in which people told me afterwards, even our candidates said that they cried when they read this call for job applications, because it was the first time they felt in this call that someone was calling directly to who they were, like the totality and wholeness of who they were as an intersectional person with a dominant Black identity. Define the qualification standards so it takes into account systemic exclusion, right? So there's, in my field, like we have a notion of a traditional academic. So they have to have a master's degree, maybe PhD. They had to have some teaching already in post-secondary. They had to have a record of research through grants and conferences, blah, blah, blah. Now, this prototype or model that we have, persona that we have of what's our ideal type is completely exclusionary for the majority of Black, Indigenous, and POC people who have been structurally kept out of post-secondary institutions. So for us to really broaden our hiring, we had to think of like, if you had been excluded or had limited access, what would your profile, your persona be? And be very explicit about that. So we looked at the Praxis Star, who again, may not have a master's degree, but have equivalent work experience, right? They may not have taught in post-secondary, but they've given workshops or have given talks to audiences, that they may not have a record of research, but they've had small commissions and projects, which means they know how to get money. They've done local professional talks. They may have written locally or had their work written about them. And then also community connector, who have been completely excluded in many ways from post-secondary institutions. So like, again, may not have a master's degree, but have other experiences or other work experiences. That they have been doing workshops and things with youth to transfer information. And it could be religious educational roles itself. And then they have a record of practice, which again may show up in community meetings that they facilitated or small projects. But again, they have a different profile of excellence that is not that model of the traditional academic, because so few BIPOC people have been given access or have been able to successfully take access into those, into that model of who they're supposed to be. And the last thing I just say, hire for critical mass. Why we had to have a cluster hire was that when we hired Black people one-on-one, we couldn't retain them because the environment, because of institutional racism, because of this white supremacist culture was so hostile that they ended up leaving. So in order to shift the culture, you need to hire for critical mass so that they can build in some ways like a space of safety and acceptedness within the group in and of itself, and then find strength in that group to be able to help shift the culture of the institution itself. So this is an image of like the OCAD Black faculty as of a month or so ago. We had 5 existing, one of which is missing in this image, Black faculty, and then we've added 5 more. And what was really a beautiful thing that happened in this conversation is that we have many different Black faculty from all different areas of the world, and they all felt that they could speak in their own accents and patois and whatever. And I always say, like, how do you know when you've reached critical mass is when people feel they can bring all of themselves. They don't have to mask or hide who they are, what language they speak, what food they eat, the way they wear their hair, all these sort of aspects. They don't have to change that, assimilate, right? They don't have to assimilate into the culture. They can bring all of who they are. And it's important to think about it in terms of 3s, because in this image, there's me, who's at the top of the institutional organizational structure in terms of power. And again, in my position, I have real power. I can say no to things and it will happen, not happen. I can say yes to things like this Indigenous cluster hire and it happens. We have faculty who are at the middle level who are influencers. And so I can't just be there by myself at the top because it needs somewhere to flow through the institution to make institutional change. So they have important work in terms of like advocating and sharing messages and building allyship amongst the other faculty and other workers basically in the institution. And then you need to have people who are at the entry level of growth. And for us, that's the students. And they are the whole reason for being and the whole reason for advocating. And you have to empower them to advocate for themselves so they're able to grow. So when you're hiring for critical mass, think about the 3s. I need to make sure I'm hiring for diversity at the top and the middle and at the entry level so that I can see how the entire institution is or is not supporting the growth of those in entry, the influence of those in the middle, and the power of those who are at the top of the institution in and of itself. So these are the 6 steps. Put Indigenous demands first. Own up to the institutional racism and white supremacy, establish authentic relationship to BIPOC communities, make the call for applications about BIPOC community interests and not just yours, define the qualification standards so that they take into account systemic exclusion, and hire in 3s for critical mass. And so I hope I've left enough time. I'm gonna leave this up. I'm gonna stop sharing. I hope we have enough time. I've left enough time to do Q&A. So.
Hi, Dr. Tunstall. I'm James. I'm going to be helping with the Q&A today, but I wanted to start by saying thank you so much for your wisdom this morning. I know the team is just ecstatic and the content you presented is incredible. So first off, just thank you for being here with us at Mozilla. And on behalf of the entire community here, we are grateful. So with that, should we jump into some questions?
Happily, thank you.
All righty. So we'll start here. One of the first questions that has come up is, and I think this is an interesting one, in the corporate and business world, have you seen any organizations creating a healthy design culture along the lines of what you've managed to do recently at OCAD?
No, but I actually had a really good conversation with a colleague of mine who works on Bay Street, which is like Wall Street in Toronto. So it's like high-powered VP executive in a large bank. And we had the conversation about the fact that the way I've laid this out is that the models that we've done in academia, and because we're in academia, it allows us to be a little more, we can pivot in some ways quite quickly, that she's looking at this model and in her position in the bank. And again, she's a person who's in power. She's like, we're going to try this out. We're going to prototype this out in my bank and figure out if we can do it there. So I think in some ways we're the test case of possibility and possibility models. But I can tell, like Sunday, I had an article that came out in the Globe and Mail that talked about especially the hiring threes. And so I've been receiving lots of emails and requests to have conversations from corporations in terms of like what it is they can do and how they can do this. And so I would say what's happening now because of the Black Lives Matter and the realization of like real structural injustice and how that affects, and the speaking out that's happening by Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities around their lack of representation, that many institutions now are open to learning, open to shifting. And the possibility model hasn't completely emerged yet, but I would say from the conversations that I'm having with corporations, that the possibility models will emerge anywhere from the next six months to 1 year. That there's some institutions that are really, really committed to making these changes. Fantastic. And we're happy to help them.
That is wonderful.
I mean, the thing is like, you know, I come from a corporate background as well. So like many of the things that I'm doing, I do as like all the things I did as a consultant, you know, at Sapien and ArcWorld, all those things I did, I still do as a dean, right? It's just my clients are different. And so all of the processes and techniques and things that I use or approach are the same, like personas, right? I created personas and I just said, oh, there's a gap in our personas. Let's create more that are more inclusive to be able to do that. So all of those tools, technically speaking, are corporate tools that I've used to bring about this transformation. So it's just a matter of repackaging them back to corporations and institutions so they can see how their own tools and processes can be used to help facilitate their own internal transformation as an institution.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Second question, how do you go about measuring belonging and inclusion?
Well, again, as part of the task force for underrepresentation, the institution did do a survey. And then this past year, we just wrapped up another survey. So you can do that. But again, the problem is that if your underrepresentation is so great, you know, like that quantitative data just doesn't, you don't have enough quantity to be able to affect quantitative data, right? As a leader, I try to listen, right? So we've recently had 2 forums. We had a Speak to Power forum for our Black students, and then we had another Speak to Power forum for our Black, Indigenous, and POC students. So it's a thing where we listen, right? We listen and we know, and they tell us all the things we're doing wrong. So creating those conditions of trust, creating those conditions in which people feel there would be no retaliation for speaking truth to power, right, is how you know. And you'll know, like I said, for me, it's sometimes it's the unexpected. So again, to be on that call with all of the new and existing Black faculty and to hear them, like again, they code shift all the time, right? To hear them feel like they didn't have to code shift, right? Like that's an indicator. Like I know we've created something different. And so looking to see in some ways like, are people feeling like they can bring more of themselves, bring more of their music, bring more of those things? And some people say, well, that's just superficial, but those are the things that people matter most to them, like being able to bring in the food that you like, being able to have the music that you want to hear, let's say as part of the environment, if you in a place where music is part of that environment, right? All of those things say to you in subtle and important ways, you belong here. And we are going to give you agency over curating in many ways this experience of being here so that you belong with a sense of agency and power around what's the culture, right? What's the culture and what's the values of the institution?
Fantastic, thank you. So we've got a series of questions, and I'll kind of clump them together around the logistics of cluster hires. There's been a lot of back channel, and we're very interested in this idea. So I'm just going to read them all, and then you can sort of tease them out. So first off, were these columns of types of individuals, for example, the Praxis star, transparent to the candidates before being hired? Why or why not? How were those columns developed? Who helped develop them? How long did that process take? And when the cluster hire happened, did it mean other people leaving, or was it a strict expansion of the number of people working at OCAD?
Okay, I'll answer that last one first. So this was, OCAD University is rich in culture, rich in values, poor in resources. So this was able to happen because, and I'll tell you like the whole story is that we had some retirements and some individuals left, which meant that I had actually 3 hiring lines because originally we said we were going to hire 3 people. I then kind of went to my boss and said, it's time, let's do a Black cluster hire. The first response was no. And then, but I kept pushing and advocating, and I'm like, here's the data. And, you know, we had the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Sustainability Initiatives, who basically creates the data, makes sure that we have the data to support our diversity program. So it's like, here's the data. Okay, you have to do consultation with the faculty, already done. And they're like, let's do it now, right? So there's all these like hoops that I had to jump through in many ways to convince my boss and my boss's boss that it was actually very little risk in doing this. Who did the work in terms of, so I had to have lots of help, right? And this is where a community is important. There was a part of like trying to make that last maybe into a pure yes that I had to get another faculty member do the advocacy because it felt like I wasn't being heard. And then they sort of helped push the last sort of tipping point of the university finally saying yes. And then it was me in some ways doing that work. Now that's my job as the dean. I write the job descriptions. I was doing the negotiation of like the budget and the lines or whatever. So that's where it's like having a person in power is really important because for those processes, I am the nodal point of power, right? So once I got the okay, then I was free to just go and do and make it happen. So writing up the different personas or sort of types, like again, I had this in my head because we actually have faculty members already. We already have employees already who look like that and have been quite successful, right? So I knew in my head that this existed and we could model this. But basically it was a matter of like 2 days of me codifying it in a form that the institution and HR would understand and accept. And it was used this is what I gave to the committee. Because again, it's a hiring committee. This is what I gave to the committee to help them, guide them in their evaluation of candidates. And so that's what they used it for. And then as part of that, then when they came back of like, who's your top favorite 3? We said, who's your top favorite 3? Not just like the ranking, who's your top favorite 3 in each of these categories? Because we wanted to make sure that we were having true diversity, not just in terms of like the color of people's skin, but true diversity in terms of like opening up the institution from those who've been structurally excluded from the institution. And the limitation of this though is that like, and we were talking about this, I think in our conversation before, is like everyone who we gave the job to are exceptionally excellent. Now they're just, instead of exceptionally excellent in the academic traditional mode, They just have other profiles of excellence. And I sort of say you're not going to achieve true diversity and equity unless you actually can bring in mediocre people. Mediocre Black people, mediocre Indigenous people, mediocre POC people. Because again, part of the structural racism is that, again, as Black, Indigenous, POC, you have to be, again, we say it's like twice as good, right? For half the recognition, half the thing. So we're not going to be able to really, until I can hire a mediocre Indigenous candidate, I know we haven't really achieved true diversity and equity, because the system is set up to, in many ways, accept only exceptional, what I call super tokens, right? So people who've already proven, and I say this as myself, people who have already proven that they can excel in that, again, white supremacist culture. Like, that is what all of my accomplishments, right, that Daria went through, all that proves is that I have been very adept and successful in navigating those systems, right? And till we dismantle those systems, right, like, that's when we have really achieved true equity, diversity, and decolonization, is when we don't pick the only brown, Black person, you know, who've proven that not only they can meet whatever mediocre standards, but that they've proven they've excelled beyond expectations in those fields. And that's the thing where, like, again, I'm a little worried about the call now for diversity, equity, and not even in some places using the language of decolonization, because what I hear in them saying around, like, oh yes, when the right person, and you know, someone who's going to be a great fit, right? Like, when I start hearing that language, then I know that they're looking for the super token. And again, super tokens need opportunities too. So I don't, you know, say that, but I'm saying the notion of being a super token, all that it proves is that I've excelled in that system, which means that I haven't in many ways been as successful in changing that system. And what you want is to bring in people who can also help you change that system, right? Because they come from a different perspective, because they've developed a different track of life, and bring that into the institution. So even in the committee, I said, I am not the profile of who we should hire. If you come to me with 3 names and they all have like the same background as I do, like Stanford or Harvard or whatever it is that you think is important, like, we're gonna have a conversation, because you're not understanding the goal of this particular search. Which is the other thing, the importance of a cluster hire, and I don't want to emphasize this, is that it creates the space for you to say, we can hire for this real diversity, right? This diversity of experiences, the diversity of success. Now, if we had a thing where we only hired one, 99.9% of the time, we're going to hire the super token. But because we had enough positions to engage with and play with, that we could say to ourselves, if we'll try for the super token, because everyone wants someone who's exceptional, right? And that's sort of in a very narrow way. But we also want to open up the space to others as well, who have not had the same opportunities or the same access to this narrow notion of what it means to be successful. And so that's an important thing about the cluster hires, that it gives the committee, in many ways, the room to be more expansive about who they could bring in. Whereas, like, again, even in the conversations we had in the committee, you know, like, there was always that push to, like, but they have a degree from Yale, we have to bring them in, right? And then that's part of, again, that white supremacist culture that says the value of that degree from Yale is higher than that value of this person who's been working in this community organization for 10 years doing this kind of work, right? And so the clustering, the multiple positions allow for you to be more expansive than your default. which is to look for the super token.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can squeeze in one last question, because it's a good one. So this is a particularly Mozillian question. We are a largely, even prior to the pandemic, we are a largely remote culture. And the question is, I'm curious to understand the way remote companies and remote work can work against the notion of decolonization. A move to assume work is abstracted from land. What additional measures, if any, should we consider in order to decolonize remote work?
So the thing that the very interesting thing about, like, it's right now we're a remote company as well. Like, we are a global remote company. Some of the things that has been very interesting in terms of how that has, in some ways, like, once you get over the inequities of tech access, right? So in the sense of, like, you know, the digital divide. And again, there's a lot of work that our, especially our IT department has been doing to address that and support that in many ways. That once you get over that, there's a way in which it has helped us in a couple ways, which are about very colonial structures. So, and again, everyone's experiencing this. So one of the very sort of white supremacist cultural values is this notion of the separation between sort of home life and work life, right? So it's like, again, if you're coming into a space of work life, into an office, in many cases, you're only bringing like 10% of who you are into that space. What's happened now is that, like, again, people are, it is now permissible within the culture for people to bring other aspects of themselves, like the fact that their parents and their kids are doing whatever kids do in terms of engaging their attention or doing things behind them. That people have things they care for in terms of plants and animals and things who might be barking in the thing. That people are playing with the notion of time, right? In the sense of that, like, again, in the conversations around remote and non-remote, we're going through this as like synchronous and asynchronous, right? So the thing is, like, there's things where for me to learn this, I don't actually need to be, quote unquote, in the room, right? I don't need to be in the Zoom room. I don't need to be able to do that. I can access that later on my own time and in my own place and in my own way. So even notions of our deadlines are beginning to shift in that way. So in some ways, if you go back to like that model of like, what are the white supremacist cultural values that are there? There are ways in which going remote is actively dismantling that. You know, like, you know, one of the conversations I had with one of our administrative staff was like the feeling like I can show up for work in a ponytail, glasses, and no makeup. And whereas in the office, I would be always, you know, suited up, so to speak. Now everyone knows that has actually no effect on my productivity. Whether I'm in sweats or whether I'm in a suit, that doesn't change the fact that I'm actually been able to get this work done for you. So once you deal with the digital divide, I think there's actually a lot of this, that remoteness has allowed for a focus on localness, which is part of like decolonization in some ways. It's, again, it's allowed us to understand like what's essential and not essential, because for a while, things that are not essential, we actually didn't have access to, which also means we actually know who's really essential. And so, like, no disrespect for the Raptors, but they're not essential. But the person who I still have to buy groceries from once a week is essential. And maybe we should change our relationship to them and how they're paid and how they're protected in the same way that we have been thinking about only for those who are the Raptors, right? So a lot of those things are actually happening. And like I said, once you address the digital divide, and I don't want to underestimate how important that is, that I see in some ways the remoteness creating more conditions for decolonization than our previous office cultures, right, that we were in.
That was a fantastic answer. And I think that brings us just a little beyond the end of our time. So thank you so much for your time and wisdom today. Thanks on behalf of all of Mozilla, and everyone, have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.